this, and we're hoping that this goes well and we'll establish a new normal. We've got this 5:30 work session that revolves around our transportation department and amendments to the UDC code. So I'll let transportation take it away.
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening, everyone. I hope I'm speaking loudly enough for the mic. Tonight's work session, there is a lot of information to go through, so I'm going to allow Dave to jump right in here in a minute. We're here to talk about the street type sections in the UDC, those graphics that you have seen before. This is a follow-up from a committee discussion we had back in October of last year. So we have several recommendations that we'd like to share with you in the upcoming slides. A couple of big purposes for why we're here and why we're going to be recommending some of these changes. A lot of them are due to the implementation of the bike ped plan and the adoption of the hub and spoke of the bike ped plan in the text amendment that you approved several months ago. What we are doing is we are linking these street types back to that text amendment that you approved. Another big component of the changes that we're showing you tonight is incorporated elements of the existing code, most notably the International Fire Code guidelines that our fire marshal applies to streets. What we're doing is we are updating the street types to reflect the International Fire Code recommendations. So currently, there have been situations where a developer comes in and submits a street that is compliant with the UDC from a transportation perspective, but is not compliant from a fire marshal perspective. And what we're doing is we're updating those graphics to make sure in the entry point that they're submitting something that is good with both departments. Go ahead and turn it over to the planning manager, Dave Cox. He'll be sharing with you some slides walking through those changes.
Well, thank you, Rob. You pretty much did my first 2 slides for me. Appreciate that. Welcome back, everyone. It's great to see everyone. All these smiling faces. I hope you're smiling. Well, we'll take your word for it. I know we have a lot of material to cover. My presentation will probably take about 25 minutes, so I don't know if there's a hard stop. Mayor or Michael, if we'll try to wrap up in time. One thing I would like to request is if you can, try to hold questions to the end. I put slide numbers on all the slides in big bold letters, so just feel free to jot down whatever your question is. I'll be glad to go back and talk about any particular one. But with that, moving forward, Rob already covered most of this issues. We're just talking about bringing everything up to code, making stuff more uniform, adhering to the fire code, and some of the elements from the bike ped plan will be included. So just some background. The City Council did a lot of functional class updates last summer. Back in June, the Mayor and Council voted to change some of the functional classifications of street types in our master plan to better adhere to federal highway guidance and the AASHTO Green Book. And one of the recommendations from that meeting was to revisit all these typical sections. So what we did is we brought that to committee in October, last autumn, and we made some changes to the alleyway definition, which went to a November council meeting, and then we decided to bring this back to a work session, and hence the reason we're here today. Back in the autumn, we recommended, staff recommended removing 3 street types, and I'm going to show you some pictures of these in just a minute. And also we wanted to make some changes to the sidewalk widths, which there's been several conversations since then, basically to either make them 5-foot sidewalks or a 10-foot multi-use path based on the code. So, and I'm going to cover that again right here. So if we don't have 5-foot sidewalks, one of the main things is the multi-use path. This is the current UDC 11.4.1 Part F. Basically, if a applicant or development is on one of these commercial corridors, which is State Route Highway 9, Crossville Road, or Holcomb Bridge, it has to have a multi-use path, regardless of what side of the road it's on. Or per the bike ped plan that the Mayor and Council adopted last December, if it happened to be on one of the hub and spoke systems, which was a multi-use path trail network that covered the entire city, depending on which side of the road the applicant was on, it could trigger a multi-use path designation. So that's one of the current rules that's in the UDC now. Rob talked about the International Fire Code. This is just a I'm not going to get too deep into the recommendations up here. It's kind of hard to read. But basically, it says you have to have certain street widths, which I'm going to show you in just a second. But this is what we're trying to avoid. Obviously, these pictures are not in Roswell. These are from far, far away. We haven't had this kind of problem, but we're trying to make our code try to avoid these in the future. Fire trucks getting stuck between parked cars or having to get up on curbs. So that's the last thing we ever want to see in our city. This is another part of the fire apparatus code that was adopted previously. I'm not going to go into this, but if you want to, staff from the fire department here, we can talk a little bit more about it. But this is kind of the gist of it that I want you guys to pay attention to, is if a road width has to meet certain fire department requirements, the main thing is if there's fire hydrants present. If there is, the road has to be at least 24 feet wide. And I have some pictures to show you what that means in just a second. If there's not fire hydrants on the road, it has to be at least 20 feet wide. So there's not a lot of this. You're mainly going to see this on alleyways or some secondary access points. But you're probably going to see most of this. It has to be at least 24 feet in most of the city. The exception is if there's buildings nearby that are 30 feet higher above the ground. That would be the building eave, kind of where the building wall meets the roof line, or the parapet of a kind of a commercial development. If it's 30 feet or higher, which is rare, you do have to have a slightly wider street width for some of the larger fire equipment. Now, what do I mean by a road width? It's not just the asphalt. That's the key takeaway I want you to see here. So I know it's a little hard to see this gray here, but this is what a cross-section of the curb and gutter looks like. And then you have the asphalt here. But when I say the road width, I'm talking about every little piece of real estate from here, the face of curb, the vertical part, across to the other side. So most curb and gutter is generally between 6 inches and 18 inches across. So if you add this side and this side together, you could have upwards of 3 feet of usable space. So if you want to have 24 feet of clearance, it has to be measured from this point to this point. So it's basically the blue here. There is a little extra space that's not counted on top of the curb, but that's only a matter of like 6 inches over to where the grass is. And this is actually a subdivision off of Willio Road. This is kind of what one of the typical sections will look like in just a moment. 24 feet of width of the road, including the curb or the gutter here. You have your 5-foot grass strip, 5-foot sidewalks, and you have the same on the opposite side. And because there's a fire hydrant here, that's the key thing. You have to have that 24-foot width. So I broke this up into 2 parts. We have a lot of typical sections, so we kind of have a lot to grind out here. But first I want to show you the 5 typical sections staff is recommending removing from the UDC, and I'll explain the reasons why. One of the primary reasons is we don't see a lot of them. Most of them don't have any actual applications in the city of Roswell. And secondly, we have other typical sections that will accommodate them. So there's a little bit of overlap. So we wanted to recommend these 5 here, and I'm going to pause and we can talk about them briefly before we move into the modifications of the rest of the UDC. So the first one here, this is 11.4.10, the local street, the sensitive section. I'm not really sure why it's called the sensitive section, but basically this is a rural section that doesn't have curb and gutter. It has these large drainage corridors, kind of like ditches. It's a little bit wider. This would probably be more used in a rural setting, like maybe some of our neighboring cities like Milton or maybe Cherokee County. This may be a little more practical, but we just don't see it here in Roswell, so staff wanted to recommend striking that. Local street, Part E, I'm still not sure how you pronounce this. It's a Woonerf or Woonerf. Basically, we call this the European model. Apparently, it's big in some parts of Europe. But it hasn't come to fruition here in Roswell yet. So we're recommending to strike it from the UDC. Principal arterials, the multi-way boulevard. As you can see, it has a very large right-of-way footprint, but we don't think it's practical due to the length of the corridor. So you can't just drop this in on one little development or parcel. You probably need a couple football fields length, or maybe even upwards of a quarter mile to actually make this feasible. So it's very unlikely this could happen with these large parking areas on the side of the roadway in Roswell. Access ways. This is basically a 2-lane road. It has a utility corridor, which is 20 feet, where you might have some high voltage power lines or some other large utility. We do not have any of these in Roswell that I'm aware of, but we can cover this with other typical sections, which you'll see in a few moments. And then lastly, for the deletions, we talked about a pedestrian passage, which most of the larger developments have pedestrian facilities within them already. So we would remove this and let some of our other on-street features cover that. So with those 5, I want to pause and just, this might be a good stopping point just to talk about those briefly, if there's any questions. And I just want to point out that just because we strike these, if the city does decide to do that, the UDC does not limit developers from proposing these innovative kind of solutions, and staff will still have the authority to either accept the road section or propose an alternative route. So there are some opportunities available to us with that. So I just want to pause for questions. Yes.
Council have any questions? Yes.
Thank you. My question is, what was the thought process of including these, or how did they get included in the UDC? Can you?
So developing the UDC took a lot of time and a lot of staff effort. We tried to encompass a lot of different ideas that we thought might be relevant to the city. However, a lot of those just didn't pan out. So these, some of the excess ones that we just haven't seen come through, and they could be covered by some of the other applications. So we kind of wanted to scrub the list, what's still there, what's being used, what developers are pursuing in the marketplace. And if they're not pursuing some of these, and they're very large, complex, typical sections, we wanted to strike them out and just rely on our core ones. Did I answer your question? I'm sorry.
So thank you for this presentation. I do remember when we discussed this back last year. So I just want to make sure I'm clear. It sounds like what I'm hearing is it's not that these choices had any negative impact to residents, and more specifically, it's just the fact they weren't used. Is that a fair summary?
I would think so, yes.
And so with that, when there's not a negative impact created to residents, my preference is to kind of leave more flexibility. And 2 examples that came up are the pedestrian passage, and I think it was the Woonarf that you called the European section. And those ones, perfect, yeah, thank you. So those ones seem like, again, I understand they haven't been used, and perhaps they won't, but you just mentioned there is always the chance that developers do have some creativity and something along those lines, and I wouldn't want them to, if that's the case, this seems like it could be fitting. The pedestrian passage certainly seems like it could be, a good fit for certain developments, and I wouldn't want there to be an extra hurdle to jump over. So that's just my initial reaction. I don't feel as strongly on this as I will, obviously, when we start discussing reducing sidewalk widths, but I just wanted to kind of air my initial reaction here.
Okay.
Thank you, and great presentation. And yes, those were the 2 that really jumped out at me too, as being looked like creative solutions that we might want to encourage. Particularly the pedestrian passage and the Woonarf. Can you describe a little bit like what the purpose of that is? That's parking? Is it used for traffic calming, or what is? Do you know what the origin is? It?
I believe it's both of those things.
Both. Okay, that's what I thought. So. Again, that seems like it might be a creative solution in some areas that we might want to present as an option.
Okay. Did you have any comments, Ralph? Sure.
So the purpose of the Woonarf, think of it as a shared facility across all users. So literally the pedestrians, the bicycles, the cars are sharing that space on the screen with very little guidance on giving one user priority over the other. It's a shared space.
But it's interrupted with an area for parking.
Correct.
Correct.
Although the screen shows parking, it does not necessarily have to include parking. The concept behind it is that all users of the right-of-way are treated equally. And there is very little positive direction or positive guidance, giving, let's say, vehicles priority over pedestrians or bicycles. It's a shared facility. It could or could not have parking.
Okay.
Additional questions?
Yeah, I have one for the multi-way boulevard. What is the reasoning behind the delete this option?
The main reason is we don't see it as a practical solution because you need a very large project to come in and implement something of this size. If you just had one parcel, you would have to have a very short length of the project. So if you're going to add this type of parking, you'd need probably a pretty sizable distance of at least a couple football fields or maybe even a quarter of a mile. Because you couldn't just do it on a couple, 150 feet. You need a large project on several parcels to make this really feasible. Also, it takes up a lot of right-of-way. So usually developers have their own parking plans for whatever site plan they develop. And they usually would have parking in a variety of different applications, but it may not be right along the street like this.
Right. And what would be the negative impact to leave this on the code?
Do you have any comment on that, Rob? Oh, sorry.
So with all of staff recommendations, the 5 that we showed you, ultimately there is no negative impact that we see to leave any of them in the code. We are proposing deletion in order to reflect what we're seeing from the marketplace and to delete some of them that we aren't seeing being used since the UDC was created. There is no harm with leaving any of them currently in the code. All we did as staff was to try and take a fresh look and see which sections do not reflect the desires of the community due to this one in particular, a very significant right-of-way take. The other thing we did in addition to this fresh look and making some recommendations for deletions that you will see later is that we have proposed a couple of additions that we do think slight modifications to some of the current sections that do reflect applications that we are seeing pretty active, both when the UDC was created and over time that are currently being submitted.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you for the input. That was the easy part. It's a little more fun now. Okay, so now we're going to talk about recommended changes of some of the elements within our existing UDC. I put this slide in here just to point out a couple things. You're going to see a lot of different numbers, ranges, and widths. I'm hoping that no one gets stuck on that or falls down the rabbit hole. I mainly want people to just look at the sidewalk widths independently, the maintenance strip, planting strips, and then ultimately the road width. And just kind of look at them one by one. And we're going to propose some recommendations to make them more uniform across the city. And all those numbers you see for those elements will feed into those totals for the right-of-way width and the road width. And then the other thing is don't pay any attention to the little pictures of the houses or anything. Those are just there for show. We're mainly just focusing on the street type here. And then all of the typical sections do accommodate utilities, whether they're in the air or they're subgrade. All the utilities are designed to be within the existing city-owned right-of-way. So here is the first one. This is your local street, and we'll work our way up to principal arterials in a few moments. This is probably the most common subdivision or suburban street we have here in Roswell. It's your approximately 24 feet or less of pavement with curb and gutter. It has the maintenance strip. I know it's really hard to see this on the outside, but the maintenance strip is on the outside here. It's about 1 foot. Then you have your 5-foot sidewalk. The planting area, which could have trees or just grass, is also 5 foot. Then you have your curb and gutter on each side of the road, and then you have your travel lane. Now, if you remember that slide I showed you at the beginning with the curb and gutter, and there's those little spaces that the fire department can drive on the curb, the 6 to 18 inches. That gets included with the road width, so that's why you can have lane widths as narrow as 10.5 feet on the asphalt, because you could have that extra little room here on the curb, or I'm sorry, in the gutter. So that's what that is. And then we have, the other thing I want to point out is we're putting little footnotes in all of these. I mentioned the multi-use path, what triggers that, either the bike ped plan or if it's on the commercial corridors. So that's kind of spelled out down here at the bottom. And then the other thing is, since this is the first one, this is probably one of the narrowest streets that we're going to have, and you're going to see these numbers slowly creep up as we kind of get further and further along. So the next one is basically the same thing except with on-street parking, just your residential street with some, they have extra space here for on-street parking. That's estimated at 7 feet per side. And the travel lane here, this is one of the things I talked about with the fire code. It's currently at 9 feet. You'd have to widen this to either 10, 12, or 13. It's 10 feet because we need 20 feet if there's no fire hydrants. If there are fire hydrants, it has to be 24 feet of clearance. That'd be your 12 foot per lane. And then if you have really large buildings, it'd have to be slightly wider. So that would make this adapt or be compliant with the fire code. There is parallel parking, but for fire department or emergency responders, we have to assume the parallel parking is occupied by vehicles and unavailable to fire trucks and ambulances. So we have to assume there's cars parked here at any time there may be an emergency. So that's why we have to increase this right here. We're also recommending, some of the typical sections recommended a 6 foot sidewalk. We're recommending that drop down to 5 based on the bike ped plan. And then if it triggers a multi-use path, you could have these be 10. And the 10 would be on whichever side the bike ped plan would specify. We'd also drop down the planting area just by 1 foot to 5 foot. And then the maintenance strip would also just drop down to 1 foot on either side. This is a little similar to the first one you saw. This is in the historic district. This is another fire code one we want to make compliant. Originally, it had 8 foot travel lanes, and based again on the fire code, it has to be 10, 12, or 13 foot to make it compliant with the International Fire Code. We're introducing the 5 to 10 foot range for sidewalks. It's already 5 now, but we're just adding in 10 because I believe there's a couple corridors in the historic district that would qualify under the bike and ped plan. And those 2 changes would make these totals jump up. This is one of the new typical sections that we created because we didn't have it in our current UDC. It's basically the same. The main difference is it does not have curb and gutter. We call this the rural section because there's no curb and gutter. There's just a grass strip here, and it basically has the same streetscape elements. You know, your 1 foot maintenance strip, your sidewalk is 5 or 10, the planting area is 5, and then the travel lanes are dependent on fire code. Okay, so that was the end of the local streets. We're moving up the ladder towards the collector streets. It's basically the same thing. I'm going to sound like a broken record as we move through this, so I apologize for that. Again, just some minor deductions. Bike lanes here are 5 feet. We're recommending they drop down to 4. In our UDC, we had bike lanes at 5 feet or sometimes even 6 feet. You'll see in a few minutes. We're recommending they become a uniform 4 feet on each side of the road, depending on whatever we have. A slight deduction from planting area. We get rid of the utility placement on this one, and then the sidewalks, again, are 5 to 10. Collector streets, you're going to notice the streets are getting a little wider. This one includes parallel parking, the bike lane, and the travel lane. It's the same features. I mentioned this a second ago. Here's one where the bike lanes would drop from 6 down to 4 under this proposal. This is a collector with no curb and gutter. This is very similar to Hardscrabble Road that the city recently built just over a year ago. It has a variant planting area because we had some variances in the right-of-way, so that we included a range there just in case we encounter that again. But again, bike lanes at 4, travel lanes at 11 to make the road width and right-of-way dimensions. It's a pretty big spread just because of the planting area is very large scale on this one. But you know, the numbers will vary. Oh, and the other thing I wanted to point out is on these are all minimum widths. So we've included ranges, but these are kind of the hard minimums you have to include. You can have some flexibility to go bigger, but we wanted to point out these are the minimum requirements. Let me see, how's the street? Okay, so now we're into arterials. I'm going to start to go a little bit faster because it's just going to be kind of repetitious. Same thing here, just slight modifications of planting areas and bike lanes. You have your center turn lane with bike lanes, and parallel parking is a potential option. This is the same thing again, just as the center, a raised median in the center of the roadway. Sidewalks are 5 or 10, and bike lanes drop to 4. And we're coming up on the end. We're now in principal arterials. These are your major arterial roads in Roswell. This is an example with a center turn lane. So think of State Route 9 through the majority of the city, or maybe parts of Holcomb Bridge on the east side of Roswell. This is one, I wanted to point this out. This is a little tricky. So we're recommending merging the multi-use path element into the sidewalks here. So we're recommending striking the multi-use path at 10 and then let the sidewalk component handle whether a multi-use path should exist or not. And again, that's dependent on the current UDC, whether it's on a commercial corridor. So for example, if this was, Highway 9, you'd have to have 10-foot sidewalks on both sides. But if it was on another arterial roadway that wasn't a commercial corridor, you would have to have 10-foot sidewalks if it was identified in the bike ped plan. So we want to account for that here. So it's 5 or 10, and it could be one, they could be different on each side or the same. It just depends where it's located in the city. So here's your principal arterial with your 6-lane. An example of this would be State Route 92, Woodstock Road or Crossville Road. It's the same element. We're recommending merging multi-use path into the sidewalks and just letting the bike ped plan or commercial corridors handle this. So a good example here, if you're on Crossville Road, that's part of the commercial corridor. So you'd have 10-foot sidewalks on both sides. But if you were further west, west of Woodstock Road or King Road, you would only have 5-foot sidewalks. So like over by the Super Target, you'd only have 5-foot sidewalks on a typical section out there because it's not on the bike ped plan. And then lastly, we have one modification to our access ways, which is kind of like an alley. Just because the buildings we have in this graphic could be higher than 30 feet, we wanted just to make sure we include a range of up to 26 feet for make sure we're compliant with the fire code. So, in conclusion, we obviously welcome your feedback, and we want to gather what your thoughts are on our staff recommendations. If there's consensus, we can bring this forward to either another work session or a future committee meeting, which then the steps would go to a text amendment initiation. We'd have to advertise the amendment, then we'd have to go to Planning Commission, and then ultimately it'd have to be read at council meeting, a first and second reading before any of this took place. So that there's a process ahead of us, but this is a good first step, just to get your feedback and see where we stand. So I appreciate you listening. I know it's not the most popular topic in transportation, but it's important that we include this in our UDC.
Thank you, Mr. Cox. Again, great presentation, very clear, very descriptive, and really appreciate that time. And transportation does get some really popular items like the bike ped master plan. I felt was a very popular item, had a lot of consensus and a lot of long-term advantages. I am going to just repeat my exact sentiment that I had last year when this was presented, which is I fully oppose this. And I feel stronger now than I did last year, given COVID, given what's going on. And basically, a big part of this is reducing sidewalk width on so many busy streets, where with COVID, one thing I've seen is there's more people walking and more people jogging than I've ever seen. And I think that's a fantastic thing. And frankly, I think it's questionable for too many people walking or jogging, even outside of COVID, can't really fit on 5-foot sidewalks when there's that much volume, because we're not talking about inside of neighborhood roads here. We're talking about collectors. We're talking about those big roads that all the neighborhoods pour into. And so to reduce the sidewalk width, I completely understand why that'd be advantageous for a developer. I think that makes perfect sense why a developer would certainly prefer to have a less wide sidewalk, but I can't understand any reason why it'd be advantageous for the people of Roswell. And that goes down to everything I've read and seen about the wider sidewalks, creating more opportunity for increased walkability and outside activity. And again, that we're witnessing the increased activity, and I think we really want to be advocates for making it comfortable, making it safe, instead of having more and more people needing to jog or walk into the street. So for that reason, again, my comments haven't changed since last year's work session.
This is my first time seeing this, and my concern is that we are reducing the sidewalks. And I know that it's going from 6 feet to 5 feet, and that 1 foot may not seem like a lot, but when you're trying to walk with somebody on a sidewalk, that's a big difference. I know that we're trying to accommodate the bike ped master plan, but there are so many. What percentage of streets does the bike ped master plan cover compared to all of the other local streets and collector streets? It's a small percentage. So it seems to me that the disadvantage of doing this is much greater than the benefit of trying to be uniform just in the small area that the bike plan covers. That's just my first take on it.
If I could say a couple of things. First off, we knew the 5 foot to 6 foot sidewalk issue would be a lively conversation, and we've talked about it a lot internally. 2 points that I just want to make sure are aired and that everyone understands. First off, yes, we talk a lot about major developments, but as staff and in working with plan review and working with community development, yes, we deal with a lot of large commercial projects, but we also deal with a lot of single-family homes. By the current code, there are often requirements for a new single-family home that is built on a undeveloped piece of property to comply with the code and build the sidewalk per code, which currently on a local street would be a 5 foot sidewalk. But there have come situations where a home has existing sidewalk, and it's very difficult for staff to look at that 5 foot sidewalk and require them to demo and construct 6. From our perspective, again, these are nuances and these are details that you may not be aware of. From transportation's perspective, there is a very, very large difference between a 4 foot sidewalk and a 5 foot sidewalk. And the reason why is the ADA accessibility argument. And we would never argue for a new sidewalk to be constructed that is less than 5 feet wide. So that is why on all of our slides, you won't see anything listed below 5 feet. We have been on that 5 foot sidewalk standard in the city for a long time. You'll see many of the older sidewalks in the historic district that were probably built at 4, but for a significant number of years, anything that we have constructed as a city project or anything that an outside party has constructed has been that 5 foot width. Our argument for the reduction in minimum sidewalk from 6 to 5 and from the minimum bike lane from either 5 or 6 to 4 is from a functionality perspective and is ultimately from a perspective that every square foot of property is significant, and we are wanting to try and provide the minimum that would still function and operate as the facility is intended. I do not think a 6 foot sidewalk operates and provides any significant added value any more than a 5 foot sidewalk. If we were talking about 5 versus 8, I would be completely with you, and that's just my personal opinion. I do think an 8-foot sidewalk and a 10-foot sidewalk, once you have that multi-use path designation and you introduce a significant added user type, I think provided great benefit. I do not think again, this is just our opinion, I do not think a 6-foot sidewalk versus a 5-foot sidewalk does provide that added level of operation, that added level of benefit. One other thing before I turn it over to questions, I do want to remind you that we have a sidewalk matrix that we have talked about for a number of years, and many of you are familiar with our sidewalk matrix, our criteria, our listing of gaps and segments. We have been working very hard on that over the past couple of months, and that's coming to a future committee meeting for you to revisit. We do that every couple of years just to refresh your minds on what that criteria is and how we rank those. All of those estimates and all of basically our assumptions for filling those gaps are currently based on that 5-foot width. So if it's the pleasure of council to maintain that thinking of 6 foot being our new minimum, and we want to be seeing 6 foot or greater on our corridors, we are going to need to make sure that we reflect that added width in our estimates. And oftentimes that's not just a simple addition of 12 inches of concrete on one side. Sometimes that comes with, and again, it's a corridor by corridor analysis. Sometimes that comes with additional wall height. Sometimes that comes with utility relocation. Sometimes that comes with a tree that we were able to avoid before with a 5-foot that we aren't able to do with a 6-foot. That varies from corridor to corridor, and that's ultimately why we wanted to approach this from a minimum to provide the operations, which for us, for a sidewalk, that minimum is the ADA width, which is 5 feet.
Thank you. So appreciate that. And again, as you know, I believe this council is always comfortable reassessing and judging different things at different points in time. You know, for the example, sidewalk matrix and everything else you're going through. With that, I think what I'd like to see staff come back with and provide is, because you mentioned the example of needing to potentially destroy a 5-foot sidewalk and put in a 6-foot. I can actually take you to different parts of the city where I walk, where I've pushed strollers, where you can clearly see there was a 4-foot sidewalk, and you can see there's a 1-foot added on, and it's walkable, it's more spacious, et cetera. So, and we both agree 5-foot much better than 4-foot. And again, I strongly believe that 5 feet for multiple adults, even walking next to each other, never mind when you have adults going both ways, given the COVID and everything else, that I just feel this is something where is definitely, you know, certainly maximizing the proximate property, but at the same time not thinking of the long-term use, joy, and safety of both the residents that will live in that development as well as all the residents walking by as well.
So just to put it in perspective, what we'd like and what we can do are sometimes different things. If you go from a 5-foot sidewalk to a 6-foot sidewalk, that's a 17% increase. As most of you know, we're $50 million behind in sidewalk building. Those are our sidewalks, not sidewalks to be done necessarily by a developer. That means now we're not $50 million behind, we're now $58.5 million behind. And so sometimes what you can have and what's nice to have are different things, and we should take that into account as we look at these things.
Thank you, Mayor. So, well, I appreciate the department bringing forward an initiative for mayor and council in consideration. Listening to all the arguments to reduce from 6 to 5, I don't see the 17% reduction from 6 to 5 or the 20% increase from 5 to 6. I don't see the need of reducing from the user perspective. I understand from the developer perspective, but from the user perspective, I think that 6 make much more sense for users. of this, especially the areas we're talking about. So I don't see any argument right now that justify to reduce this from 6 to 5. As well as I don't see any really negative impact to justify deleting these sections that we spoke previously, the streets. So I don't see that they have any negative impact by having them in there. And I do see a negative impact reducing from 6 to 5.
I know of one in particular that I had worked on years and years and years ago, up on Alpharetta Highway, and now it's a car wash. It used to be a car dealership, a little tiny thing right across from the hospital. But I remember years ago what we did is there's still a specimen tree in the right-of-way. And rather than taking the sidewalk into the site, I was on the design review board at the time, we required that they do a kind of like a planking decking to go around the tree, so it would not impact the tree as much as a concrete sidewalk. So going back to a situation like that, and now that that's a car wash, we let them just put in concrete all around that tree. So my question is, do you have the latitude to save trees? If a 5-foot sidewalk works better than a 6-foot as far as the health and safety of a tree or the tree canopy, do you have the latitude to do that?
Mohammed, tell me if I'm off base on this. So my understanding of the current code is that per the sections that we've shown you, it would be difficult for us to require a development to what we're talking about as a boardwalk / deck type of solution. It would be difficult for us as staff to require a developer to do that as a condition of development, but that doesn't prohibit us from having conversations with design review board, having conversations with mayor and council as an application goes through the process to dial in what that
For
site
example,
plan looks like.
this one, the car wash, did not go through mayor and council. It was a right. So I'm just wondering if this is just a staff policy or if this is a policy that we need to influence in order to save trees.
I'm looking at Lenore and I'm looking at Mohammed.
Yeah, I guess for the if the council wants to give us that latitude, if we want to keep the 6 foot and on a case by case basis, so 6 foot would be the standard if that's what the city council wants to do, but on a case by case basis, if a developer or a property owner, if they present a hardship to us, which could be a tree, could be a utility pole, or maybe a retaining wall, then yes, if the council wants to give that latitude to staff, I think that would be a good way, a good compromise of the situation, because if we want to have wider sidewalks in the city, that's good to have, but in certain situations, I think we're going to need that latitude, again, to save that tree, to avoid that utility pole, or have a less height and a less length of a retaining wall. So I think even 1 foot would be 1 foot of a latitude with staff, with a presented, documented hardship from a developer. I think it would be a good thing if we had that.
But could that also be a hardship based on the city? So we want to protect our tree canopy, and we do that above all else. So it would actually be our hardship, not his, because 9 times out of the 10, the developer doesn't care. Well, saving a tree is not a developer's priority, so.
Yes, and it could be a staff-initiated hardship, and of course, then we would take and use that latitude on the city projects as well, because there's a lot of situations in our city, it's a completely built-out city with a lot of terrain and trees, so I think it would be good to have that latitude if the council decides to go with the 6 foot width.
Romberg, thank you.
Thank you. I just want to add that there are a couple of other overlapping allowances for variances in the design criteria outside of Article 11, which Mohammed, as a transportation director, has jurisdiction over. He does have some latitude for making some adjustments. There's some language in there that says, under certain conditions, there are some minor modifications he can make, as long as the other laws like ADA and so forth aren't being violated. And then under the tree protection ordinance, there are additional things that have flexibilities that between myself as engineering director, planning and zoning director, and the transportation director can make modifications to those design criteria in order to preserve the tree. So there's a lot of different moving pieces in there that we kind of look at all at once to make sure that all of those things are being adhered to. When it's within the right-of-way, there are more controls given to the transportation director because ultimately they have to be the ones to maintain it. And so there's a lot more consideration given over to his position. And then when it comes to just in general within the development, it's more the engineering director and the planning and zoning director who have control over making modifications to that criteria based on that site condition to prioritize all the things that need to be protected and then what order to do that in. So hopefully that helps clear that up.
Thank you. Councilmember Palermo.
Excellent. Thank you, Mayor Henry. I just want to point out that I think that's actually a great idea of kind of thinking outside the box, that instead of just reducing sidewalk with requirements citywide, we're looking at what a community benefit is. And I do want to specifically call something out about it, though, as well. So Mayor Henry brought up the fact, and I agree, that the community benefits from the tree canopy. And so I think that is an opportunity for some latitude on that. And then, Mr. Ralph, you had brought up utility poles, retaining walls, other aspects. And my concern there is those are things that the owner of the property knows of ahead of time when they're buying. There's not that same benefit to the community, all those things. So I'd have concerns with casting too wide of a net on where that is, but I think around trees is something where I certainly fully support and think is a great benefit to the community.
Yes, Councilmember Wilsey.
I mean, I would just like to add on to that and just say that in many cases, and probably 80% of the new sidewalk cases, the city is going to be the one spending the money and needing to consider working around the trees and the terrain. So just, I guess I would like to see, depending on what the actual terrain and situation is, that the city, us, when we're the developer, that we do have that latitude.
Councilmember Zapata.
Thank you. So how will it work? Just around the tree will be 5, and then as soon as past the tree, open to 6 again? Or maybe a utility pole, but not the whole design, right, the project?
So, yes, the answer to that is yes, and we have some examples of that on projects that we've built. The one that comes to mind first is the multi-use trail that we constructed on Holcomb Bridge as a bond project several years ago. There were some situations where we have a uniform width and we tapered down either for a wall or for a utility pole. So we would minimize the length of 5-foot sidewalk to get around the specific hardship or the specific topography issue.
Thank you.
Additional comments from council? Is there anyone in the public that would like to come forward and speak? Well, you all tell me, do you have the direction you need as far as sensing the will of council and
So this
what
was,
you might want to bring back to us?
this was great feedback, and we appreciate everyone's time. We hear you loud and clear. We will be bringing a lot of these changes. Some may have slight modifications to what you've seen here today to a future committee meeting and ultimately move forward to initiation. We appreciate everyone's time. We know this is not the most exciting material in the world, but it's important for us. This is something that we've struggled with our partners in community development for a very long time, and we're trying to reduce the amount of ultimately conflicts between the fire department and between us and between community development. So we appreciate everyone's time.
Thank you so much. We are adjourned.